Hello and welcome to ESST1006 Human Impacts on the Environment. And today I want to talk to you about human impacts on forests and forest resources as part of an ongoing quest to try and give you information on how humans are impacting on our environment globally today. So in this lecture I want to use the DPSIR framework for discussing human impacts on the environment and in particular forest resources. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about what are some of the drivers affecting forest resources. Then I'm going to take a look at some of the pressures on the resource. So for instance, how forests are used by humans and how they are pressured by humans. Next, we'll take a look at status and trends in forest resources. And there's a lot of information there on forest status and what is happening around the world to forests today. Next, we'll take a look on some of the impacts on the resource. So how humans are implicated in the trends in the resource, particularly in reductions in the resource. And in particular, we'll take a look at how ecosystem services are being impaired by those pressures on the resource and the implications of those impacts on ecosystem services for human well-being. And then finally, but briefly, we'll take a look at some of the responses to those impacts on the resource. So what sort of management responses are being taken to mitigate the impacts on those ecosystem services which are being compromised by impacts on forests. All right, so let's move straight along now to drivers affecting forest resources. So, as mentioned with other environmental resources like water resources and air, atmospheric resources, and so on, some of the main driving factors on forest resources are increases in human population size. We've been through this many times before, but increases in human population size mean that humans as a global species require more resources as the population size increases. That means that the room for other natural ecosystems and the species which inhabit them decrease over time. Not only with increasing human population size, but also increasing GDP in different regions around the world are also increasing the demand for resources around the world. So not only is it that we are increasing the number of people, but we're also increasing the amount of resources the existing people use. And that is basically as human living standards increase, technology is used to increase those living standards. And because technology uses more resources, then the humans which have the increased technology use more resources. So in terms of energy, they increase their carbon footprint. In terms of water use, they increase their water footprint. All of these things force out other ecosystems and affect other ecosystems like forests. We can also take a look at technological and scientific innovations as a driver which will affect forest use or other resources. And in the case of forests, there is a big increase in the amount of forest which can be used as technological and scientific innovations increase with time. Okay, so for instance, when it comes to using forests, many forests were simply inaccessible for human forest use, particularly things like timber getting or clearing the forest for agriculture. simply because humans did not have the capacity to clear those forests and also to get the resources out of that forest to sell at some sort of market. Okay? Post-World War II, during World War II, the development of the tank and other tracked vehicles, also all-terrain vehicles, allowed humans, and in particular Western countries, to get into these forests and harvest them and extract the resource. Prior to that, humans just couldn't get in there. They weren't able to move their machinery and harvest on an industrial scale. But that all changed with technological advances. Also with technological advances, particularly in things like agriculture, increased mechanization in agriculture and intensification of agriculture, that also had implications for the amount of area needed for food production. In many cases around the world, post-World War II, the area dramatically decreased as the areas for agriculture were shifted to more centralized locations, and many areas were simply abandoned to agriculture. Okay, so those were relatively small parts of the world, but where the effect occurred, it was quite dramatic. So places like North America, particularly the eastern part of North America, meant that agriculture declined and forests regrew. Trinidad also benefited from this effect, as a lot of the plantation agriculture declined. Things like cocoa moved to big plantations in West Africa and Brazil, and cocoa plantations in Trinidad declined. In the same way with sugar, sugar was mainly produced after World War II, and even before that, before World War I, around the start of the 1900s, sugar was increasingly produced in temperate countries by things like beet plantations. And sugar cane declined so that large areas of sugarcane land were abandoned in the tropical regions. Less so in Trinidad, that more came after World War II. So technological and scientific innovations reduced the area needed for agriculture or shifted it to other places and caused the growth of forest areas. Okay? There are also cultural, socio-economic and institutional processes in production which changed. So places like the United States, the decline in manufacturing from about the 1970s on, as wages increased in these areas and the opening up of transport and globalization in the economy meant that manufacturing was shifted to areas of the world where wages were relatively cheap and allowed manufacturing to occur at much lower costs. So these shifts meant that places like the United States moved much away from a manufacturing economy and much more into a service-based economy. So they started moving into financial sectors and recreational sectors and food and beverage sectors and so on. So employment moved away from manufacturing into service sector, and that had an impact on forests because forests were no longer needed in a manufacturing sector. and people in a service sector began to use forests in a much more recreational sense. Other drivers influencing forest reserves resources are global climate change. Global climate change to date hasn't really changed a lot of forest area, but it's predicted to become much more intense in the future, particularly when it's coupled with changes in land use by people. So places like the Amazon basin are likely to experience more droughts, and because of the more droughts and human land use changes, which will introduce more fire into the region, you're going to get a dramatic decrease in forest area as drought makes the forest more vulnerable to fire, and the presence of human agricultural practices which use fire in those regions combine to destroy remaining areas of forest in the Amazon basin. So it's thought that global climate change is going to induce a big contraction in forest areas as time goes on. Okay, so those are some of the main drivers that we think are affecting forest resources. So here's one of those drivers, population density. This is a map based on data from the World Bank, and it shows different areas of the world with different population densities. You can see the largest population densities are in India, China, Southeast Asia, and in Europe. Trinidad is probably a little blip in there, which is very high population density. And the reason I'm showing you this is because we can compare the amount of forest in these highly dense areas and see that there is a direct relationship between, an inverse relationship between population density and forest cover. So these graphs here from a publication, scientific publication, plotted areas of forest cover, so from low to high, against human population density on a log scale from low to high. And we can see that when you have high forest cover, you tend to have low human population density. And when you have high human population density, you tend to have low forest cover. Okay? And these are in developing countries mainly. And these are developing countries. All right, so in this publication, they're talking about an FT point. We don't need to worry about that too much. What it is talking about, however, is a country which is either increasing its forest area or decreasing its forest area. And the turnaround point from where a country switches from decreasing its forest area, in other words, forest is being cleared for agriculture, and then it goes into increasing its forest area because agriculture is no longer clearing large areas of land, is called the FT, or forest transition point they're talking about in this paper. Okay? And all around the world we are getting those places where people are moving away from agriculture, or technologies in agriculture are increasing to a point where the intensification of agriculture means that you don't need so much area of agriculture, and people are moving out of the agriculture sector into either manufacturing or services. And because of that, you're getting a change of uh, places moving away from destroying forest, and the forest is then recolonizing areas which are no longer used in agriculture. Okay? And that's a very real thing which is happening around the world, particularly in areas where the GDP is relatively high. So that's why I'm showing you this map, showing you areas where GDP is high, and those tend to be the areas where forest cover is actually increasing. All right. I'm showing you this graph because it does show that the relationship between per capita forest cover, in other words, the amount of forest per person, does tend to be somewhat dependent on GDP, but it is also dependent on the ability of the country to hold forest cover, to have forest cover, and also the size of that country. Okay? It also has a lot to do with past forest use. All right? Generally, countries which have large areas of forest per capita tend to be fairly large countries. So countries like Australia, United States, Canada, they tend to have large areas of forest. Countries which tend to have fairly low population densities also tend to have large areas of forest. So the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, have relatively low population densities and therefore have large areas of forest per capita. So this sector of the graph show where you plot hectares of forest per capita against GDP per capita. Okay, you would have countries which, first of all, have very large areas, enough, and then low densities of people, and you would have large areas of forest and also large areas of GDP. Countries which tend to have fairly large GDPs but low forest areas tend to have high population densities, and they tend to be the European countries and other places like Japan. So Netherlands, United Kingdom, Denmark, France, and Germany, they all have high population densities and high GDPs, so they tend to have low forest areas per capita. Interestingly, all of these countries would have had large forest amounts. They are biophysically capable of having large forest areas. So it is likely that in the past, these countries did have large forest areas, which were then cleared for agricultural production and subsequently then on to manufacturing and now in service sectors. Okay? If we look at the lower side of per capita forest cover, the countries which tend to have large amounts of forest but still low GDP tend to be again the large countries: Russia, Brazil, Central African Republic. They're all fairly large countries, and so they have room for forests. Okay? Countries which tend to have high population densities and are relatively small tend to have low forest per capita. An exception there is China, which is a large country, but it has really high population densities and therefore it has much less room for forests. India also is a large country, but with high population densities. Rwanda is a small country and it has high population densities, some of the largest in the world, so it tends to have fairly low areas for forests. Okay? So what are some of the biggest drivers for forest loss at the moment and projected to be in 2050? As I said, cropland expansion, increasing human populations need bigger areas to grow food. So cropland expansion and pasture land expansion tend to be some of the main drivers of forest loss. Timber extraction doesn't really drive forest loss. It degrades forest, but the forest is still there. Firewood extraction, also when it's controlled, doesn't necessarily drive forest loss. Mining, it's fairly low again, and climate change now isn't thought to be a big driver of forest loss, but it may be more in the future. Interestingly, a lot of people think that urban infrastructure is causing a lot of forest loss, okay? Both now and is likely to increase in 2050, okay? Getting a little bit into trends, and we probably shouldn't now, but what are you going to do? Agriculture is projected to induce less forest loss in the future, as is timber extraction and fuelwood extraction. But urban infrastructure is going to likely induce more forest loss in the future. So that brings us on to some of the pressures that the drivers put on forest resources. Some of the things in here we touched upon, some of the pressures caused by these drivers. So let's talk first of all about forests are used for many different resources by humans. So humans use forests for many different things. They use them for timber production. They use them for non-timber production like fruits and nuts and rubber and materials for building houses and so on. There are many different uses for forests in different parts of the world. Some people would use forests mainly for timber. In other parts of the world, forests are mainly used for fuel wood. And in other parts of the world, forests are mainly used for pulp, which is used in manufacturing paper. All of these different uses put different types of pressure on forests. People tend to use forests for either a single use or multiple uses. Multiple use forests can be used for things like hunting for wild meat, can be used for conservation of biodiversity. Forests may also be used for timber production, also may be used for shifting cultivation as part of the shifting cultivation cycle. Okay? And that's opposed to single-use forests, where forests tend to be used for just one purpose only. And if they're used for one purpose only, quite often that means they're modified to maximize that use. So they may be turned into forest plantations for producing, say, timber, like the teak plantations in Trinidad, or maybe even cocoa plantations, okay, like which have cocoa trees mainly, okay. Ownership generally has a big influence on this forest use. Government forests tend to be multiple use because governments will try and please as many people in their society as possible. And private forests tend to be single use because private forests need to satisfy only one landowner. Okay? And whether or not they're used for multiple use or single use has a big influence on the types of use and therefore the pressure on that particular forest. whether that forest is being cleared for a plantation or whether a natural forest remains as a host for wild meat in the form of agouti and deer and lap and so on. The majority of forest around the world tends to be used by humans for fuel wood, surprisingly enough. Forests around the world tend to be used for firewood and for domestic heating, and that tends to be the majority of forest biomass use around the world. Forests are not only used for biomass, however, not only used for goods, they are also prominently used around the world for services, particularly things like regulating services in terms of water production and so on. But we'll get into that in just a minute. So, pressures on forest use revolve around the different types of forest use there is. And there are forest use, timber is a big one, fodder, litter, compost, fuel wood, medicinal plants, all can come from forest. And then the services which are provided by forest, wildlife, aesthetic recreation, biodiversity conservation, paper, pulp, are all used by people in forests. The amount of biomass which is used by people, surprisingly, the majority of forest biomass is used for energy use. And by energy use, that would be fuel wood, for firewood, and charcoal for domestic consumption. So for places like Africa and Asia, the vast majority of people's domestic energy use comes from forests, from fuel wood and charcoal. And the next largest is construction, so things like timber for construction, and then the next largest use would be paper. And paper use has increased since the 1960s, and also energy has increased with increasing population size. Okay, some of the other things have increased as well, things like the dark green there, particle board and other paper and pulpwood, veneer sheets have increased over time. Okay, so the vast majority of forests are used for firewood. We can break these things down somewhat. We're just considering here wood fuel, which would be firewood, and industrial roundwood, which would be timber, in different parts of the world. So for instance, Africa and Asia, the vast majority of wood which is used from forests for fuel wood, and much less is used for timber. But if we compare that with Europe and North America, we would tend to find that the vast majority of timber or wood removed from forests is for timber production. Only a small amount is used for fuel wood, for firewood. So the pressures in that case on forests tend to be mainly in terms of timber removed for wood. Similarly, in Oceania, it's mainly timber removed for timber production for wood products, which to make furniture and construction and that sort of thing. In South America, it's a bit 50-50. A lot of people still use the forest for fuel wood, but there is still a large amount of industrial timber production as well. And here we have an infographic which you can study at your leisure, produced by FAO Stats, which talk about how people use forests. So about 1.6 billion people use forests every year. And that contributes about 108 billion US dollars per year in terms of usage. Okay, a contribution to the world's economy. So take a look at that in the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm putting up on my e-learning. So there you have some of the pressures, mainly through firewood production and timber production, but also through conversion of forests to non-forest uses. And that's what we're going to talk about here in Global Forest Status and Trends. Probably the most easily measured statistic on forests is how much forest that we have. And the area of forest today is basically decreasing. And it has been decreasing since 10,000 years ago, since the last ice age finished. Today there are approximately 4 billion hectares of forests around the world. When forests are defined as areas with greater than 10% tree cover, which are either natural or degraded, native or artificial. And that area is declining by about 0.08% annually, or about 3.3 million hectares annually. If you look at the FAO infographic, that means about a lot of football fields, 5.2 million hectares, that's even greater, equivalent to the size of a soccer field every second. Okay, so that's fairly large. Not great. Okay, so 0.08% may sound like a small amount, but when you put it in the case of about, I got 3.3 million from my source, which I thought was FAO, but the FAO infographic there says about 5.4 million hectares annually. That is a considerable amount, okay? But it's not all even. The majority of this loss of forest is happening in tropical areas, as we'll see in a graphic in just a minute. So that we are losing forests more in some areas than others. And those areas are mainly tropical forest areas. Okay? And actually in some parts of the world, forests are actually regrowing. So we're actually getting an increase in forest. And that has to do with that forest turnaround point that I was telling you about, where agriculture is intensifying in smaller areas, and also where people are moving away from agriculture and into manufacturing and service sectors. Agriculture is reducing in size, and because agriculture occupies a lot of the lands which forest needs, forests are recolonizing. Brazil and Southeast Asian forests are where forests are being lost, also in West and Central Africa. North America and Europe are areas where forests are regrowing. So North America and Europe are places where forests would normally or biophysically can occur, but the forests were chopped down thousands of years ago, usually a couple of thousand years before Christ, and now as agriculture contracts into more dense areas, or agriculture is moved overseas into more developing countries, the areas of forest in these North America and Europe are actually growing once again. Okay? And so the reasons for the country showing a net increase or a net decrease in forest area tends to be due to the drivers. And generally those are, at the moment, socio-economic drivers, where a country needs more agriculture or needs less agriculture will drive whether the forest increases or decreases. Something that we're less sure about is the rate at which natural forests are being degraded. And that is less possible to see with satellite technology. So we are having greater trouble looking at the rate of which forests are being degraded. But it is thought that degradation of natural forests is occurring at least as fast as deforestation, if not faster. And we are actually degrading our natural forests, not entirely losing them, but certainly degrading them, either through fires or through logging, opening up the canopy, and so on. That degradation of the forests means that those forests are less useful for things like biodiversity conservation or timber production and so on. And that makes the case for saving those forests in an economic sense more hard to make. So in turn that will feed forward into maybe driving loss of those forests as governments feel like the forests aren't pulling their weight economically and it's better to just get rid of them. All right, so just some graphics to support what we were just saying about global forest status and trends. Here is a status snapshot of forests around the world as of about 2010. Remember, this is areas where tree cover is greater than about 10%. Okay, the main areas of forest, as you can see, are in the tropical regions, Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and the Amazon basin, and also in the boreal forests. So the conifer forests, which stretch across the northern continents, in Canada, northern Europe, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. So the reason why we still have large amounts of forest here in the northern part of the continent is that they're just not good for agriculture. So they have escaped being cleared for agriculture. They're too damn cold to produce any crops. The eastern part of the United States is now under a lot of tree cover because most of the agricultural productivity in North America is in the prairie states or the grassland states. Much of eastern United States was actually cleared immediately after colonization by Europeans, but has since regenerated to forest. Similarly, northern Europe tends to get most of its agricultural productivity from Central Asia and also from the United States, and therefore tends to have a higher density of forests than in places like Central Asia and so on. Okay, and particularly places like India. So India has a really high population of people and therefore a low forest cover. China is about half and half. It has fairly low forest cover in the north, but a fairly decent forest cover in the more tropical south. Okay. Looking at the trends of deforestation, Deforestation prior to 1700 was massive in temperate areas. So this would have represented deforestation in Europe mainly, but also in China and in, to a lesser extent, North America. And that deforestation declined up until the 1850s and then the 1900s. And post 1900s, it's fallen off. So there's very little forest being lost in temperate forests. And that is, the reason for that is twofold. First of all, there is very little forest left to lose now. But secondly, the movement away from agriculture in temperate regions means that forest is actually regrowing. The pattern in tropical forests, on the other hand, is more or less the opposite, at least up until 1970s, 1980s. Tropical forest loss was very low pre-1700s, mainly because countries in tropical areas showed very little movement towards industrialization prior to the 1700s. Showed very little movement towards, not industrialization, intensive agriculture or improvement of agriculture. It was mainly shifting cultivation. Then as European expansion got underway, more forests were cleared for agriculture. That began to fall as decolonization occurred, and then rose again as independent countries began to clear forests to increase their economies and tax bases and increase the amount of area that they use for agriculture. That has now begun to fall somewhat as industrialization occurs and intensification of agriculture occurs. Okay? So some of the trends in forests, in temperate forests, less forests are being lost and forests are actually regenerating. In tropical forests, more forests are being lost, but that is beginning to taper off up until 2010 as industrialization and intensification of agriculture occurs in places like Brazil and Southeast Asia. So the annual change in forest area, Brazil, Southeast Asia, are some of the areas which are losing the most forest, okay, as land is cleared for agriculture. Australia is also losing a lot of forest, converting into agriculture. China, on the other hand, shows a large amount of reforestation, and that is part of a national policy there in China to reforest to combat collapses in ecosystem services like air pollution control, water control, and erosion control. So benefits of forests are being pursued in China as problems with the environment take hold, and reforestation is seen as a way to get back more of those, get back more of the ecosystem services which have been lost. Just reflecting some of those trends. In the past 2 decades, from 1990, in South America, there's been a massive loss of tropical forests. So if you can measure out, looks like about 4 or 5 million hectares, okay, in the decade from 1990 to 2000, and a similar amount from 2000 to 2010. Very little lost in comparison in North America, and in fact, From 2000 to 2010, there has been almost zero loss of forest. So the loss and the gain of forest has been balanced. In Africa, similarly to South America, there has been a big loss in forests as developing countries clear more forest for agriculture. But in Europe, there has been a net gain of forests. Similarly, in Asia, there's been a net gain of forests, and I think that's mainly due to the big increase in afforestation in China. Oceania, which would be places like Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia, and the Pacific Islands, we have a pretty much neutral amount of forest change from 1990 to 2000, but from about 2000 to 2010, we've seen a significant decrease in forest area, forest loss, and that's probably mainly due to increased rates of deforestation in New Guinea there. So generally, Africa and South America, big decreases in tropical forests. Europe and in Asia, big increases in forests, mainly boreal forests, recolonizing. Okay? So what are some of the main impacts on forest resources? We've pretty much seen that, but what are some of the main impacts on humans of loss of this forest resource? So the main impacts: forest area is dwindling and remaining forest is being degraded and fragmented. Human well-being relies on provisioning, regulating, and cultural services provided by ecosystem services. Okay, so basically forests provide humans in a particular area with all the ecosystem services. So if you have a human society living in or next to a forest, they are usually deriving a lot of ecosystem services from those forests. So all the elements of human well-being, security, basic materials for a good life, health and social relations, all of them humans will derive from forests. And since forests are being lost, these elements of human well-being are being compromised. Okay? Some societies take directly from forest ecosystems for things like timber, fuel wood, for firewood, for domestic consumption, but also services such as flood regulation, water production, pollination services, all come from forest ecosystems, but not directly from forest ecosystems. And we can see that it is possible to live without forests. So a place like Barbados essentially has very little or no forests. Okay? But if you do live without forests, at least some ecosystem services need to be imported, or they need to be paid for in cash. So for instance, in Barbados, domestic energy needs to be brought into the country in the form of natural gas and petroleum, okay, for domestic fuel use. Okay, so a place like Barbados needs to import its natural gas. A place like Guyana can live with a lot of charcoal or fuel wood. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily need natural gas to be imported. Okay, so that ecosystem service of fuel wood production is lost in Barbados, so something has to be imported to replace that. Similarly, in Barbados, things like agricultural production You can argue that it has been compromised by loss of forest and loss of pollinators of crops. So productivity in Barbados for many domestic crops, short crops and so on, may be lower than they necessarily should be because of pollination services being lost. Okay? Water production and so on will also be compromised by loss of forests. So if you have a country where the watersheds have been almost completely cleared, they are going to run out of water during the dry seasons. So they will either need to import water or have the energy to run a desalination plant on that island. Okay, so just I've showed you this graphic before, showing you it again, so it must be important, I guess. We have our ecosystem services of provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services, and those ecosystem services support the constituents of human well-being, which are security, basic materials for a good life, health, and good social relations. So provisioning provides food for a good life and also food for health. Regulating services provide security from natural disasters like flooding and so on, and also provides water which is needed for a good life and health and so on. Forests will also provide cultural things with good social relations, so you can go out there with your mates and go hunting for a agouti, and also allow people of a more quieter disposition to go walking or hiking in a forest and increase their health in that way. Okay, so forests provide all of these things and therefore support all of the constituents of human well-being to a greater or lesser extent in different parts of the world. Okay? So here are some of the forest resources which are used by people and impact on ecosystem services. Oh yeah, one of the ecosystem services that it impacts on is carbon sequestration, which keeps and dampens down global climate change. Forests are critical in the carbon cycle of the earth. They take up and soak up massive amounts of carbon and also act as huge carbon stores. So if we lose that carbon from the forests, it all goes into the atmosphere and increases the amount of global warming, which is going to compromise human security, also compromise human provisioning services and so on. Okay. Forests also provide large habitats for biodiversity conservation. If we don't have forests, then many species would tend to go extinct. Providers of important environmental services, like I said, water production and resilience against disasters, recreation, and so on. Forests support livelihood and economic opportunities. So livelihood, you need your fuel energies, but also providing timber for foreign markets. So getting some sort of pathway into the cash economy. All right. So forests are used by humans in all sorts of different ways to promote their well-being. Here's another graphic which came up when I searched for forest uses and ecosystem services. This study compared plantations with natural forests and looked at the different ecosystem services but mainly provisioning and regulating ecosystem services that plantations provide compared to natural forests. And they found that provisioning services from plantations gave you less food but more timber than natural forests, which makes sense, I guess. If you've got a timber plantation, you're going to get a lot more timber, but you're going to get a lot less food. So things like wild meat, fruits, and nuts are going to be found mainly in natural forests. In the regulating services, it seems that climate regulation, carbon sequestration, wildlife, and flood control are all better catered for in a natural forest and less delivered in a plantation forest. So if you have a single-use forest, like a plantation, more ecosystem services are compromised compared to a natural forest. And about the only ecosystem service which is promoted in a plantation tends to be timber production. Okay? But just look at all the different ecosystem services which are provided by both natural forests and plantation forests. Similarly, in this infographic, which looks at how, or the different ecosystem services provided by forests in Nepal. So Nepal is that small little country just north of India, which is in the foothills and the southern slopes of the Himalayan mountains. You look at all the different ecosystem uses that we have in the forests, in the upland regions, in the midland regions, on the foothills, and in the lowland regions. And you can see there's a different shape of use of forests. The midland regions and the lowland regions tend to be more similar. They're skewed towards timber, forage, and food production. But in the upland regions, timber, forage, and food production are very minor uses. And the uses of forest are skewed more towards erosion control, soil, making sure that soil is still there, and air quality regulation, would you believe, and also religious and cultural benefits. Okay, so forests are used in different ways in different parts of Nepal. Okay, in the upper slopes, they're used more for soil conservation. In the lower regions, they're used more for timber, forage, and food production. So forests used everywhere. All right, so we've taken a look at some of the drivers behind the pressures. We've taken a look at the pressures. We've taken a look at some of the statuses and trends of forests. And we're finally taking a look at impacts on human ecosystems and ecosystem services and on human well-being. And finally, we take a look at briefly some of the responses to those impacts on human well-being in forests and ecosystem services. Some of the main management strategies which are being used to try and maintain those ecosystem services is to try and prevent the uncontrolled loss of forests. So there's a lot more land use planning being put in to try and preserve forests in a human-altered landscape, to try and make sure that forests aren't lost wholesale, that forests are preserved and in at least some of the landscape to achieve at least some of those those ecosystem services like regulation. So for instance, we can plan to keep forests in the upper parts of a catchment area to enable a much better regulation of floods. So in the upper part of the catchment, where things tend to be more steep and you would tend to lose more soil, and also water would run off more quickly. If you have more trees, then runoff would be minimized, both preventing floods and erosion. Okay? So leaving forests in areas where they're going to be most useful in providing ecosystem services is down to land use planning. And that is one response to try and prevent loss of those ecosystem services provided by forests. Also, we'd take a look at better logging practices to minimize or eliminate forest degradation. So if we are able to harvest our forests in ways which doesn't degrade them or open up the canopy too much, then we are able to minimize degradation in that forest. Controlling forest fires also minimizes degradation. Unfortunately, whenever we have humans in a landscape, forest fires will tend to go up, particularly in combination with global climate change, which will increase the amount of drought periods. So we need to better control forest fires. And that is something which is very important in places like Trinidad, controlling forest fires, because forest fires are one of the two biggest degrading agents in our forests today. Establishing more protected areas, and that is all part of land use planning and preventing uncontrolled loss of forests. If we reserve particular parts of the country for forests so that forests are protected in those areas, we will be able to preserve the ecosystem services that those forests provide. Also, stepping up forest restoration and planting trees in landscapes strategically, i.e. riparian restoration. Riparian restoration would provide those ecosystem services of flood control and erosion control. China is leading the way in this, but also places like Cuba. They have large amounts of forest restoration in their landscape, and therefore their countries tend to show a lot more reforestation rather than forest loss. And the reason why they're putting those more trees in to reinstate the ecosystem services provided by those forests in those countries. Eventually, everywhere around the world will reinstitute forests if they need to, if there isn't enough forests in their area. They will have to plant more to reinstate those ecosystem services. One place where forests would be greatly needed is in urban areas, and urban forestry at the moment is a growing pattern around the developed world, where planting trees along streets and in public areas brings many benefits to urban areas. You can imagine the East-West corridor in Trinidad would benefit massively with a big campaign of planting street trees. The temperature at ground level would fall dramatically, and you would be able to walk around a hell of a lot more comfortably than you can nowadays. When if you walk around in the hot sun, you're really taking your life into your own hands, because you'll probably dehydrate and pass away in a drain somewhere. Okay? Well, that's a bit dramatic, but urban forestry would certainly make living in the East-West corridor a much more attractive and comfortable proposition than it is today. All right. Well, hopefully I've convinced you that forests give you a large amount of ecosystem services. We need to keep them around, and people need to keep them around, but they are being lost, so we need to do something about them being lost. Okay? Thank you very much for listening to the lecture, and I will post this on my learning, and look out for questions on forests and forest ecosystem services in the exam. Bye-bye now.